Good day, class. Today is the second lecture in Western Civ 1, and today we're going to be going over the ancient Hebrews and the early Greeks. I call this lecture the origins of Western political philosophy for a reason. You may have heard of the term Judeo-Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian culture. The reason why people use this term to describe Western Europe and the United States is because the religious traditions, and since religion plays a key role in the development of society, law, politics, but the religious tradition of the West is firmly rooted in the ancient Hebrews, or the Jews. We'll also start today talking about the ancient Greeks, because while the Jewish tradition is the foundation for the Western religious system and the religious tradition, the Greeks contribute to Western philosophy and Western government. The idea of Western ways of thinking, the idea that individuals should have a right to have an input in their society. Of course, I'm talking about the idea of democracy. We'll talk about other ideas that the Greeks give to the Western mindset. So let's get started. Abraham. Abraham, according to the Bible, is the father of the Hebrew people. Now, Abraham came from the city of Ur. For those of you who remember the last lecture, Ur is here in Mesopotamia. Ur is one of the earliest cities in recorded history. So, around 2000 to 1800 BC, Abraham migrated, and not just himself, but his family. And when I say Abraham's family migrated, I'm not talking a family in the way we think of families today, which is husband, wife, and children. Abraham's family consisted of not only himself and his wife and his immediate children, but his tribe, his cousins, his nephews and nieces. They made this trek from Ur, from Ur here, more than likely up through the Fertile Crescent. Again, this area bordered between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and then traveled down into what becomes known as the land of Canaan. During this trek from the city of Ur, which took several years, the Bible says that God came to Abraham. Now, of course, this is a college course, and we're not here to talk theology, and we're not here to talk religion. However, since religion plays a key role in the development of society, we have to look at what the people's perception of religion and, of course, divine intervention, how those things affect their society. And according to the Bible, God made a covenant with Abraham. What is a covenant? I'm leaving this dramatic pause here so that you guys can think about this, because God establishes a covenant with Abraham. What does that mean? What does a covenant mean? Well, again, in the simplest of terms, a covenant is a contract. So God, according to the Bible, said that he would establish a covenant as an everlasting covenant between himself and Abraham's descendants. He would give the land of Canaan, where you, Abraham and his family, were alien. And in exchange for giving this land to Abraham and his descendants, Abraham and his descendants would consider God, or Yahweh, to be their only God. So it's at this moment that the Jewish and, of course, later on Christian traditions can trace their roots. Excuse the little blurb right there, my mouse pad malfunction. So before this, what religion was Abraham? More than likely, Abraham was of the same religious tradition as his contemporaries in Mesopotamia, believing in multiple gods. It is here that the Jewish people are truly born. As we will talk about, the Jewish religion is unique in that it is monotheistic. So, between the time of Abraham, which was around 2000 to 1800 BC, and the 14th to 12th century, the Hebrew people grew and flourished in the land of Canaan. However, sometime during the Middle Kingdom era of Egypt, the reason why I'm using such broad time dates is because historians find it hard to actually place when these events happened. But sometime during the era of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, famine and drought hit the land of Canaan. And so the descendants of Abraham moved into Egypt. Now, to those of you who are familiar with your Sunday school stories, you may remember the tale of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers because Joseph was the favorite of their father Jacob. Joseph, of course, entered the land of Egypt as a slave, but didn't stay a slave there for long because, according to the Bible, he had visions. And these visions allowed Joseph to not only free himself, but enter the bureaucracy, to become part of the bureaucratic class of Egyptian society. If you guys remember from the last lecture, the Pharaoh and his immediate family were the only nobles in Egypt. The bureaucracy administered the government of Egypt, these non-nobles. And at the head of this administration was a fellow by the name of the Grand Vizier. His title, I should say, was the Grand Vizier. Well, Joseph, whether because of visions or because he was intelligent and knew how to play politics, Joseph would become the Grand Vizier of Egypt. So when his brothers and his father are forced to come into the land of Egypt, they are met by their brother or their son, who is now the Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier having power only surpassed by that of Pharaoh. However, after the death of Joseph, and of course after the fall of the Middle Kingdom during the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos dominated Egypt and forced it into a vassal status, those foreign peoples who remained in Egypt were considered outsiders. And it's during this time period that the Hebrew people were forced into slavery. So between the end of the Middle Kingdom and somewhere between the 14th to 12th century BC, the Hebrew people were forced into slavery, into bondage. Sometime between the 14th and 12th centuries, a man by the name of Moses would free the Hebrew people. Now, according to the Bible, Moses was born to Hebrew slaves, set adrift in a wicker basket, to be adopted by the sister of the reigning Pharaoh and raised in Pharaoh's court, to be considered a second son, if you will. What historians know for certain is that the Hebrew people would be led out of bondage by Moses. All of the supernatural occurrences that are relayed by the Bible in the course of Moses' work in Egypt cannot be verified. However, we do know that the Hebrew people left Egypt sometime between the 14th and 12th centuries. Again, historians have a difficult time of actually dating this occurrence. It's during this exodus that supposedly Moses receives the Ten Commandments, of course written on those 2 tablets of stone. Let's look at these 10 Commandments. if you'll notice, the very first three deal with God. Again, going back to that original covenant that Abraham made with God. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Thou shalt not make any graven images. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. So, these three are considered the most important if you think that these are in order according to priority. But look at these things from a non-religious view. If a covenant is a contract, these can be considered the stipulations, the clauses of the contract. According to the Hebrew tradition, God would allow the Jewish people to flourish unless they failed to carry out these stipulations. So, these religious tenets, these ideas that there is one God, Yahweh, or what many Christians call Jehovah, this one God is both a God who will help his chosen people, but also at the same time punish them if they fail to uphold the contract. The Ten Commandments also point out one thing that was unique for the most part in ancient times, that the Hebrew people believed in only one God. This wasn't where you had your one favorite God, where you believed that the God of your local city was strongest there. This is the idea that there was only one God, period. There were no other deities. There were no other spiritual elements that were on the same level as God. You had angels, you had demons, you had Lucifer, but they did not compare to the power of God. God was the creator of the universe. He was all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing. And so Yahweh's teachings given to the Hebrew people were originally passed down by mouth. And so between 1000 BC and 400 BC, a social class develops in Israel, or within the Hebrew people. And of course, these are the rabbi, the spiritual leaders of Jewish society. And originally, these rabbi were tasked with keeping in their heads the teachings of Yahweh. However, by 400 BC, the rabbis had written down Yahweh's teaching into what becomes known as the Torah. Now, the first 3 books of the Torah will also become the first part of the Old Testament. So, in many ways, part of the Hebrew tradition is key also to the Western Christian tradition as well. The Hebrew culture has more defining it than just the Torah, because the rabbi class is also tasked with interpreting Yahweh's teachings. Whether we like to admit it or not, but if you read the Bible, many times it seems that you can't really figure out what the Bible is saying. This is why there are multiple denominations in Christianity. This is why in churches like my church that I grew up within, the Baptist church, people would get mad because of the preacher's teachings, and they would go and create their own church. Well, the rabbis in Hebrew society were tasked with interpreting God. And of course, after writing down Yahweh's teachings, they would keep records of these rabbinical discussions. They would keep track of what they were talking about, keeping track of if they were talking about what does God mean for the family, what does God mean for law, what does the Torah tell us about how we should act between each other. And they would keep track of this, and these interpretations were recorded in what becomes known as the Talmud. So, while the Torah are the direct raw information from God himself, the Talmud can be what you might consider the instruction manual for Jewish life. And so these two works become the basis for Jewish identity. But Jewish identity is more than just the Talmud and the Torah. It's their experiences. It's the experience of being, first, the chosen people of God, the legacy of Abraham and the covenant with God. The exodus out of Egypt, being saved. But once the Jews fled from Egypt, this process of identity building continued, because the conquest of Canaan was also formative for the idea of what it means to be Hebrew, to be Jewish. Because, to put it bluntly, Canaan wasn't empty. We have this simplistic idea sometimes that when the Hebrews of old left Egypt, they fled back to Canaan, set up their lives, and went about their lives like anybody else would. However, during the intervening years, while they were in Egypt, Israel was occupied by numerous tribes, the most notable being the Philistines. And so, during their move back into Canaan, the promised land, the land promised to them by that first covenant with Abraham, the Hebrews of old had to eliminate those people who were already there. This is one of the, what you might call, dirty secrets of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Because the people who were there already, they didn't welcome the Hebrew people. They saw them instead as invaders. These were people who were coming in trying to take their resources, their land. And so, when Joshua, the person who succeeded Moses as leader of the Hebrew people, led the Jews into Canaan or Palestine, they took it by force. And the Bible relates this. If you really read the Bible, when it's talking about Joshua's war against the Philistines, it's brutal. And this is nothing that other people didn't do as well. So it's not something that the Hebrew people are guilty of alone. Life was hard back then. Land was valuable. Water and other resources were, well, to put it bluntly, the difference between life and death. So when the Hebrews entered Palestine, when they took Jericho after the walls fell, they not only killed all the males of the society. The Bible records that they killed men, women, children. They even killed the livestock in some cases. In short, they wiped the land clean of the previous occupants. By 1000 BC, the Hebrew people established Israel, a kingdom in its own right. And by 1000 BC, David would become one of the greatest leaders of this new kingdom. Now, David extended the boundaries of Israel by war. He fought many battles. He also is noted for making Jerusalem the political capital of this new Hebrew nation. As such, since religion played such a key role for Jewish society, David planned to build a temple at the center of this new capital. However, David would not have time and would die before the temple was actually built. However, his successor, Solomon, would be the one to build the temple. We'll talk about the temple in a larger scheme here in a minute. But while David established control through force, Solomon instead used what you might call his brain. The Bible notes that Solomon was the man who asked God only for wisdom. And maybe the Bible is recording something accurately, because sources outside the Bible show that Solomon instead was able to rule through peace treaties. Instead of waging war against his neighbors, Solomon married numerous wives from other leaders of surrounding tribes. In short, Solomon married into the families. Solomon also had a problem in that the 12 tribes of Israel, the traditional makeup of the Hebrew people, were a nomadic people. Their main source of food was not stationary farming, but instead herding. So you have these 12 large tribal groups within the kingdom of Israel, and they're moving around all over the place. One of the things that governments have to deal with, and governments need, is a set of ways in order to control a population. Even in the most democratic, in the most egalitarian societies, governments need ways to keep records. They need ways to tax the people in order to run the government. And the nomadic lifestyle of the 12 tribes of Israel made this incredibly difficult for Solomon's government. So what Solomon did was he divided Israel into 12 sections, giving each part to one tribe, saying, this is yours to rule, but you must stay within it. And so what this allowed Solomon to do was to basically nail down these nomadic people, to keep track of them, have a way of taxing them, having a way of basically governing the Hebrew people. Now, the taxes that Solomon exacted from the 12 tribes were used to build public works. Jerusalem as a whole was built in this way. And of course, Solomon was the king of Israel who would finally initiate the construction of the temple to God, or Yahweh. Now, one of the most important aspects of Hebrew tradition, even today, is the fact that the Jewish people would lose their land. They would be forced out and forced to become exiles. Because after the reign of Solomon, the tribes of Israel, those of the north, and of course those in the south, would come into conflict with each other. They would, put it bluntly, they wouldn't get along. And so the kingdom of David and Solomon would be divided. The kingdom of Israel would be the half that was of the north. Judea would be that of the south. By splitting the kingdom, it effectively halved their strength. And so, at first, the kingdom of Israel was forced to submit to foreign powers. Later, Judea would be forced to submit. And a series of outside powers would come to control Israel and Judea. The Jewish people were displaced as a way to control them. So, when the Babylonians, the Archimedes, the Alexandrians, the Seleucids, and finally the Romans ruled over the land of Canaan, or the land what would become known as the land of Palestine, each successive empire would force the Hebrews out. They would force parts of the population to flee. As we talked about last lecture, the king of the new Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, would force Jews into exile in Babylon, forced them to live outside of Palestine in order to hold them as hostages. over time, there would be more Jewish people living outside of the land of Palestine than within it. Now, during this time period of foreign rule, the Jewish people would come into conflict with the powers that ruled them, because the Hebrew people considered themselves to be an exceptional people, to be the chosen people of God, and they only worshiped only one God. However, many of the empires that came to dominate the Hebrew people were ruled by individuals who claimed to be gods themselves. In the case of Babylon, the king of Babylon declared himself to be a divinity. Cults were set up to worship the leaders of these outside powers, like the king of Babylon. And of course, the Jewish people refused to worship these kings. Thus, they were persecuted because of this. They were seen as disloyal, as alien, and as threats. And so, part of the Jewish identity is an identity of being a persecuted class. This didn't mean that the Jews accepted being persecuted. During the time of foreign domination, there were several attempts to reassert and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. One of the last ones happened in 70 AD. In response to the protest and uprisings of the Jewish people in Palestine, the Romans, who then controlled Jerusalem and the areas around it, would burn the temple to the ground, destroying it. Now, the picture you see on this slide is the mosque built on what is known as the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, as Muslims call it. This is a very contentious piece of property because it is built on the site of the destroyed remains of Solomon's temple. The Wailing Wall, which is just down the hill from the Dome of the Rock, is a foundation, if you will, one of the last remaining walls of the old temple. So Jews claim this territory as holy. Muslims claim it as holy. And of course, Christians claim it as holy. And so you have religion and religious differences boiling over. And of course, this affects politics. It affects social tensions. You have some Jews in Israel today who claim that the government of Israel should go in and bulldoze the mosque that is there and rebuild the temple. Of course, this would infuriate the Muslims of the area and probably lead to war. However, are Jews and Christians welcomed within this mosque? Well, no, not really, because mosques are meant for, of course, Muslims. And so you get this tension even today. Now, as I said, Jews were forced to live in strange lands, considering themselves to be unique people, the chosen people of God, brought them into tension with the various leaders of these various empires. Some just sort of hunkered down and tried to, stay under the radar, if you will. Other Jews rebelled. The last rebellion happened in the 1st century AD. As I said, in 70 AD, the Romans burnt down the temple in response to this. It is during this time period that a prophet, a Jew, who preached a new religion would come to the fore. And of course, I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, it's interesting to note that Jesus and his early followers, the early Christians, would run afoul of both the establishment in the same way that Hebrews had been persecuted by the various governments that had ruled them. But they would also run afoul of these Jewish nationalists, because the Roman authorities who ruled Palestine during this time period of the first century would see Christians as a threat just as much as they saw the rebelling Jews as threats. However, these Jewish nationalists who wanted to reestablish the kingdom of Israel, they saw Jesus and his followers as threats as well, because Jesus was Jewish, his early followers were Jewish. And so Jesus and his message of peace, his message of don't worry about the kingdom here and now, but instead look to the afterlife, look toward heaven, was seen as a threat to motivating a full-fledged rebellion against Roman authority. And so the early Christians would find allies in neither the established authorities nor the rebelling Jews. We'll talk about the Jews occasionally throughout the rest of this course, because as Europe develops, as Roman society develops, the Hebrew people who are forced and dispersed throughout the various lands of the ancient world will play a part in the development of Western civilization. So we'll come back and hit them again and again, but you need to keep this sort of idea of Jewish identity in the back of your mind. Also, what would be, in your ideas, a key contribution of Jewish society to the modern Western world? I'll give you a couple of mine. First, of course, is the idea of a single God. The Jewish God is the same God of Christianity. You cannot have Christianity unless you have Judaism. But also the idea of contract. The covenant of Abraham and the stipulations as laid out by the Ten Commandments would not only become the basis of Jewish and Christian religion, but would become a part of Western law, Western ethics. Case in point, if you travel to the Middle East today, or especially to Asia, and you speak about contract, their ideas of contracts are not exactly the same as a Western idea of contract. Their idea of how society should be run and administered are definitely not the same as that of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So our society, one of its key cornerstones, is of course the legacy of the ancient Hebrew people. Another cornerstone of Western society are the contribution of the ancient Greeks. So let's talk about them. To understand the Greeks, we must first understand Greece itself. Greece, this peninsula hanging down between Italy and what is modern-day Turkey, is a very rocky, very mountainous part of the world. However, it has great climate. Basically, it's summer year-round. This is why Greece is one of the biggest vacation spots in the world. But because of its poor topography, its poor terrain, Greece and its peoples will become a seafaring society. Their society will revolve around the sea, especially the Aegean. This doesn't mean that the various cities that start to develop in Greece are not agricultural. But Greek culture will be spread and transmitted far beyond the coast of Greece because of the nature of their coastline. Now, around 2000 BC, the first Greek culture is the culture of the Mycenaeans. Now, as you probably know from looking at your textbooks, let me turn over here and if you'll notice from your textbook, they spend 2 or 3 pages talking about the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. And if you notice, they don't have that much to say. The reason why is historians don't know that much about the Mycenaeans. The Minoan culture was relatively unknown. It was sort of like a fairy tale up until recently, when archaeologists were able to dig up confirmation that this Minoan culture actually existed on the island of Crete. But what we do know about the early Mycenaean culture is that it expanded beyond the lower peninsula of Greece. This, of course, brought it into conflict with societies that existed, neighboring Greece. One of these was the city-state of Troy. Around 1200 BC, we have the Trojan War. Again, up until recently, the Trojan War was something that could not be confirmed. Historians didn't know if it actually happened or if it was just something that the early Greeks made up. However, in the late 1800s, I should say, archaeologists actually discovered where Troy was at. They confirmed the existence of Troy, and from the fact that these remains showed the clear evidence of fighting and the city being burned to the ground, they knew that Troy had been destroyed by a cataclysmic conflict. And so the early accounts of the Trojan War were confirmed. Now, the Trojan War, while the Greeks were victorious in it, caused a breakdown in Greek society. It marked the end of Mycenaean culture. Your book calls this the Dark Ages that existed between 1100 BC and 750 BC. It's during this time period that the Greeks would become fragmented, and what would become center to Greek society was their immediate city-state. And we'll talk about what a city-state here is in a minute. However, it didn't mean that the Greeks as a whole lost their common identity. Greeks often referred to what was known as Heliakon, or Greek identity. Herodotus, an early historian of ancient Greece, noted this Greek identity. And Herodotus noted that it was based on 2 things. First, a common tradition like the Trojan War. Again, Herodotus referring back to Homer and his Iliad and Odyssey. But it was also the common religion that Greeks shared. Now, Greeks were a polytheistic people. They believed in multiple gods. Now, their polytheistic society was slightly different from the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians. Gods were a personification of nature. You have, for example, Zeus, this here stylized comic book image of him, was the god of thunder and lightning. You have Ares, god of war. You have the god of the sea. You have the god of beauty, the god of intelligence, and the god of envy. You have the god of the underworld. So they personified nature, but they also personified human nature. Ares, for example, again, was the god of war. And since they personified human nature, Greek gods were very human themselves. They were not like the Hebrew god. They were not perfect. They were not just. They were not all-knowing. Instead, they had many of the vices, many of the flaws that humans had. They were envious, jealous, petty. Zeus's own wife, Hera, schemed against him. And she had good reason, because Zeus was notorious for changing himself into an animal, such as a hawk or a duck or a bull, and going to Earth to have sex with human women. If you guys ever make it onto UT campus, go to the Humanities Plaza, and you'll see a naked woman riding a bull. This is known as Europa and the Bull, and it's a illustration of Zeus, the bull, trying to seduce Europa. And so this religion, which all Greeks subscribed to, was a unifying factor because the Greeks had a common set of gods and they respected each. However, this religion also was a force of fragmentation, because like Mesopotamia, each Greek city-state, each Greek smaller society had their own patron god. Troy, for example's patron god was that of Apollo. Athens' patron god was Athena, god of intelligence. And so religion was a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it socially united the Greeks. On the other, it acted as a force of fragmentation. Because Greek society had been fragmented by the Trojan War, what became center to Greek political and social development was the city-state, or the polis. Now, initially, during what your book calls the Dark Ages of Greek history, these were merely fortified sites where farmers and fishermen could retreat to in case of attack. However, why keep all of your goods outside of this fortification, only to lose them when you run off for the benefits of its protection? So these fortified sites grew, and as the populations grew, they became more urban and more commercial. Merchants moved their goods into these fortified cities. Farmers would have their fields, but many of them would live within the cities, or at least this is where they came to trade. And so as these cities became more urban, they also became the center of politics and the center of political authority. Now, this is one thing that you have to remember. Since these city-states are developing independently of each other, they will take on distinct characteristics from each other. Whether you talk about from the north, Actium, down to Thebes and Corinth, Athens, all the way to the south at Sparta. All of these city-states are different, and their differences will increase the fragmentation, cause Greece to never really unify, and cause Greece to fight amongst itself. The two most different are Athens and Sparta, and those are the ones that we're going to talk about during this lecture. Let's talk about Sparta first. Sparta, of course, is the city-state as illustrated in the movie 300. And of course, as you can see, caution, this is Sparta. Now, Sparta is an interesting city. It's an interesting society in that, in theory, all true Spartans were equal citizens in the society. Spartans, in order to have this egalitarian lifestyle, discouraged economic and social distinctions. Spartans, in short, didn't wear bling. Spartans instead practiced an austere lifestyle. They didn't wear a lot of jewelry. Their clothes were fairly plain, even in the ruling elites. They disavowed luxuries and the accumulation of great wealth. This is why today Spartan means practicing self-denial, uncompromising discipline, and being resolute in the face of danger. Now, Sparta, or I should say, Sparta was not made up of only true Spartan citizens. This is the irony of Sparta. While all true Spartan citizens were considered equal, true Spartan citizens made up a minority of the population. Because within Sparta, you had two other groups. You had the Perori, which were free individuals, craftsmen, merchants, and farmers. But since they did not serve in the Spartan military, they were not considered full-fledged citizens. Only Spartans who served for about 20 years in the Spartan military were considered full citizens of Sparta. Now, why did the Spartan culture demand Spartans to be a warrior or martial culture? Well, that's because the vast majority of the people living in Sparta were not free. They were slaves known as helots. These are interesting individuals in that they were not slaves in the sense of, say, slaves of the South before the Civil War. They were not pure property. However, they were not free. Helots were captives of Sparta's numerous war with its neighboring Greek city-states, and at times outnumbered Spartan citizens, the full-fledged ones and the Perori combined, by 10 to 1. And so while the Helots provided the labor to Sparta, Sparta being primarily an agricultural farming city-state, they posed an enormous risk. So the Spartan answer was to have a warrior culture. Young men were brought up in this martial culture to learn how to fight. So boys, even before they were sent off to school at the age of 6 years old, were trained by their mothers to be true to the warrior culture of Sparta. As we'll talk about, women played a crucial role in Spartan culture. Now these young boys would be sent off at the age of 6 or 7 to live in barracks and train. And they would train until the age of 16 or 17 years old. So for 10 years, these young Spartans would train to fight and kill, to be organized, to be stable in battle. And they had to prove themselves before they, quote, graduated. And you see this in the movie 300. Those of you who have watched it, you remember, if you'll remember, Leonidas sort of thinks back, has a sort of a what do they call it in the movies, a flashback to when he was a young boy and he had to kill the wolf. Well, that was the first test. About halfway through their training, boys would be taken out with no clothes, no weapons, and basically dropped off in the middle of nowhere. And they were forced to survive. If they survived, they could continue on. At the end of their training, sort of the final exam for a Spartan warrior, was that he had to escape. He had to leave the barracks without being detected. Had to find a helot and kill that helot and make it back to the barracks before anybody detected he was gone nor what he had done. So this Spartan educational system was designed to build or designed to create men that could kill without thinking, who would do anything, even at the cost of their own life, to guarantee the survival of their city-state, to fight either as a team or fight individually, to fight very openly or to fight by stealth. Basically, to be excellent soldiers. And they would be excellent soldiers until they were able to retire, usually around the age of 40. So for 20 years, these Spartans would be tasked with defending and waging war against their neighbors. Now, during this 20-year hitch with the military, they would not live at home. They would live in barracks, only coming home occasionally to see their families. Now, they may be married, but they didn't live with their wives. In many ways, they came home only to spend a couple of nights with their wives in order to, quote, what you might say, replenish the ranks. Now, women played a key role in this. Not only did they give birth to new Spartan soldiers, but they acted as sort of the social glue that forced them off to battle. Supposedly, a famous quote by Spartan mothers and wives was for Spartan soldiers to come back with your shield or on it. Basically, come back victorious or don't come back at all. Now, Spartan government is interesting because it has elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. First, what is monarchy? Again, I'm going to have a dramatic pause here and let you think about it. What is oligarchy? And what is democracy? Well, monarchy means rule by one. Oligarchy means rule by the few. And democracy means rule by the people. Spartan government had elements of all three, because there were two kings of Spartan. These two kings were not political leaders. They were mainly military leaders. So in the movie 300, we see Leonidas, who was one of the hereditary kings of Sparta. But there was another one there. Why two? Well, Spartan government was designed so that when one king led the Spartan military to battle, another king would stay behind with a small group or a small part of the Spartan military in order to protect Sparta itself. Now, the administration of Sparta, the leaders of Sparta, were a 5-member council. They were known as the ephors. And this council of elders, if you will, or these 5 ephors, were elected by a council of elders. And these council of elders was elected by all true Spartan citizens. So again, only those Spartans who had served in the military or were currently serving in the military could vote. Now, Sparta was a patriarchal society, but it was less patriarchal than other Greek city-states. Again, remember what the term patriarchy means. Patriarchy means rule by men. Now, in Sparta, women could not vote, but women were not considered property. They were not considered inferior to men in the same way that other Greek city-states considered women. Women in Sparta could own land. They received an education. And they handled most of the domestic affairs because their husbands were living in barracks or off fighting wars. So it is the women who took care of business during the normal day-to-day operation of Sparta. And as such, while they couldn't vote, Women could address the council. They could make claims of redress in the courts. Now, women were considered valuable not only because they carried out the everyday business while their husbands were either fighting or training, but just as importantly, they were mothers. They raised the children up until age 6 or 7. So the very first lessons that these young future soldiers learned were not instilled by their fathers, but by their mothers. It was the mothers who first trained their sons to wield weapons, because as part of their education, women were trained to fight. And so it was the children, when they left to go off to be trained at age 6 or 7, they looked back on the teachings of their mothers on how to be good Spartan soldiers. Now, one reason why women were trained to fight was not just to train their sons to fight, but because they were expected to fight in the event that Sparta itself was attacked. Let's give this hypothetical situation. One of the Spartan kings takes the vast majority of the Spartan army off to war, either with another Greek city-state or with a power outside of Greece. And an enemy of Sparta takes advantage of this and sends its army against Sparta. They may be able to overwhelm the other king and the small guard there standing to protect Sparta. Who protects Sparta? Well, guess what? The women who were trained to fight would take up weapons and defend their city-state. Now, Sparta had a rival. This, of course, being the city of Athens. Athens, in a lot of ways, was a polar opposite of Sparta. While Sparta, here at the southern part of the Greek peninsula, was mainly agricultural, Athens, on the other hand, was commercial. Going back really quick, hold on. Athens, its culture would be determined by the sea rather than the lands around it. So, what is the history of Athens? Well, before 594 BC, Athens was ruled by an elected oligarchy. You had 5 archons, or 5 elders, who ruled Athens. Now, these archons not only came from the elite class, they were elected by the elites. So the original government of Athens did not represent the Athenian society as a whole. As such, you see the gap between rich and poor growing wider and wider, and of course this leads to tensions. Many poor Athenians either had to sell family members into slavery or sell themselves into slavery in order to pay debts. So you have this problem where the elites, the minority in Athenian society, were in tension with the poorer classes, and it threatened to tear Athens apart. Now, as your book points out, Athens would become a democracy. This transition from oligarchy to democracy was started by a fellow by the name of Solon. Solon was one of these 5 archons, and he saw that these tensions could rip Athens apart. So, as a solution to this, Solon put forward a compromise where the rich would get to keep their lands. In exchange, the poor would have their debts canceled, and those that were in slavery because of debt would be freed. Now, Solon would be helped along by another fellow by the name of, if I can pronounce this right, Cleisthenes. It's in the book. Yes, sorry, I can't pronounce that. Now, These reforms would devolve power away from the archons toward mass elections. These reforms that were put forward would instead rely upon the demos. The dems, or the demos, were the constituent parts of Athens, the neighborhoods, if you will. And so, instead of relying upon the decisions of 5 archons, the dems would have a mass meeting of all property holders, all male property holders. And these male property holders would vote on issues concerning them. So let's look at the difference between Athenian culture and Spartan's culture. Sparta was a martial culture. It prized military values. It prized above all order. Athens, on the other hand, was a commercial culture. Instead of order, Athens prized commercial gain. Combined with its commercial culture, Athens was a maritime power. Instead of relying upon agriculture, Athens relied on fishing and trade for its sustenance. Because it relied on trade, and because it prized commercial values over those of Spartan order, Athenian society was a society of arts, architecture, and philosophy. We'll talk about how Athenian society is the Greece that we often think of when you mention ancient Greece. We'll talk about that next lecture. Now, the Greeks were not isolated and insulated from the rest of the world. While these city-states developed, other powers developed as well. In the Middle East, the Persian Empire developed. Now, your book, even though it's not in the selected readings, has a small section talking about, at the end of chapter 2, talking about the rise of the Persian Empire. I would suggest that you at least skim over those pages so that you have some context for the discussion over this lecture. Now, in the Middle East, the Persian culture, or the Persian Empire, had taken over much of the lands of the modern Middle East, including modern-day Turkey. However, this western coast of modern-day Turkey, here, what the Greeks called Ionia, was what you might consider the farthest flung reaches of the Persian Empire. The Persians, contrary to the movie 300, were not monsters. The Persians allowed local rule. However, they did not tolerate disloyalty. And so, during the time period before 500 BC, again, let me get my cursor here. Before 500 BC, Greeks established colonies here on the Ionian coast. Most of these colonies were colonies of Athens, since Athens was the supreme maritime culture, or the largest maritime culture in Greek society. Now, around 500 BC, these Greek colonies here in Ionia rebelled against Persian authority. They either ran out or killed local Persian administrators. As a result, the emperor, or the king of Persia, a fellow by the name of Darius, not only wanted to put down these Ionian colonies, he wanted to punish the Greek city-state most responsible for their support, and that, of course, was Athens. So starting in 499, Persia mounted a maritime assault against Athens. Now let's look at this. This is a David and Goliath battle, because You have this huge Persian Empire that stretches from the borders of India all the way over into what is today called the Balkans. At that time, they even controlled Egypt. And against them is not all of Greece, but instead just the city-state of Athens. And so Darius will send a naval force to land on the coast of Greece outside of Athens at a place called Marathon. Now this army is huge. Let me turn my notes here really quick so I can give you sort of a breakdown. Some scholars argue that this military was close to 200,000 men, or 250,000 men. The Athenians had only 10,000 men. Now, the battle, which occurred in 490 BC, is important because the Greeks win. And how do they win at this first battle? Well, instead of attacking the Persians on the beach immediately, the leaders of the Athenians instead stand back, allow the Persians to exhaust their resources, and expecting attack at any moment, the Persians also kept their soldiers up almost 24 hours a day. So after 8 days, the Persians are without rest. They're running low on food and water. The Greeks, on the other hand, are well rested, being supplied by friendly Greek farmers. And so on that 8th day, the Greeks attack the Persian lines. At the Battle of Marathon, if I can get my cursor working here, what the Greeks do is they trick the Persians tactically into charging. The Greeks advance, but then the center falls back right here. The Persians think that the Greeks are breaking and are going to retreat. And so they rush the Greek lines. What this allows is that the flanks of the Athenian military sweep in and threaten to cut off the Persians here from their supply ships on the coast. This causes the Persians to panic, and they flee toward the coast. At this moment, the Greeks, not only their flanks, but their center force, rush the Persians. Now, this is very interesting because it's not something the Greeks do often. Ancient Greeks often fought shoving matches. We'll talk about hoplite warfare here in a minute. And this is one thing that I want to talk about during our discussion section. Well, how the Greeks normally fought were in tightly packed ranks, normally 12 to 20 people wide and 12 to 20 people deep. This was known as the phalanx. This was something that was conducive to slow, methodical advances. It wasn't something that was good for speed. But here at Marathon, the Greeks abandoned the phalanx and instead charged the fleeing Persians. Contemporary accounts of this attack point out that the Persians wade into the water. They throw away their weapons as they try and clamber aboard the ships. And the Greeks are literally hacking them to death even in the water. This is a great victory for the Athenians. Over 6,000 Persians died. Only about 190 Athenians died. However, this doesn't mean that the Persians are completely defeated, because many of the Persian soldiers either were still on the ships or made it back to the ships. And so there's a threat that they will sail down the coast and attack Athens itself. So the Athenian general in charge orders his best runner to run back to Athens and warn the Athenian soldiers that were left behind to defend the city, that the Persians might be coming and that they should prepare for an attack. And so this Athenian runner strips down naked, runs, I believe it's, what is a marathon, 26 miles, as fast as he can, gives the message to the head of the Athenian military at Athens, and then drops dead. The Persians do try and make an attack, but the Athenians, have been warned, had prepared their defenses and defend the city successfully. Darius is forced to retreat. And it's today that the modern marathons, whether it be the Boston Marathon or marathons here in Knoxville or Nashville, are held to commemorate this event. Now, Darius doesn't concede defeat. Instead, he goes back to Persia and starts planning an even larger, more audacious attack against Greece. And not just Athens this time. He's going to eliminate this thorn in his side by conquering all of Greece and incorporating it into his empire. Now, Darius doesn't live to launch this attack. Darius will die before that. However, his son Xerxes will finish planning this attack and launch it in 480 BC. So, let me see if I can find a map real quick. Going back to the map, here we are. Instead of launching an attack using naval forces, this is something that equalizes the forces between the Greeks and the Persians. Because remember, the Greeks, for the most part, are a seagoing people. Athens especially. Persia, with its vast population, is mainly a land power. So what do the Persians do? And how do you get this large army to Greece? Well, they plan to march this army overland and march it down the Greek peninsula until they finally conquer all of Greece, especially that city-state of Athens. There's one natural barrier in their way, and this is the Dardanelles Straits right here. On this map, it looks like just a razor-thin piece of blue. However, this strait is a couple of miles wide. So the Persians come up with an ingenious solution. Instead of using their navy to transport the troops overland, they will take part of that navy, cut it down to the main deck, tie these ships together with one of the largest around and longest natural ropes ever built, and string it across the Dardanelles Straits so that this huge land army can march overland through Thrace and Macedon into the city-states of ancient Greece. Now, some of these Greek societies, namely Macedon and Thrace in the north, will succumb. They will literally just give in to Persian demands, because Xerxes doesn't want to fight if he doesn't have to. So he sends forward messengers asking for a tribute of water and earth as symbols of the Greek acceptance of Persian domination. And of course you see this stylized in the movie 300. In Sparta, Xerxes' messengers are killed. They're pushed into a giant pit. They're also killed in Athens. And so Xerxes marches his army south to punish these defiant Greek city-states. Now, these are Greek city-states. Again, I can't stress this enough. These are independent city-states. They don't work together well. They don't play nice together. And so these city-states, it's going to take them time to cooperate and organize an army. there are also individuals within each of these city-states, Sparta included, who don't want to fight the Persians. Again, you see this in the movie 300. So it is King Leonidas of Sparta who will take his own guard. He doesn't take the entire Spartan military, only his personal guard north to try and buy time for this process of building a unified Greek defense. He finds the perfect place to stand and fight at Thermopylae. Thermopylae today, and I've seen pictures of Thermopylae today, it has a fairly wide coastline. However, archaeologists have made a good case that this is because of erosion, and that at the time of the Persian Wars, what you see in the movie 300 was more accurate. Very narrow pass, bounded on one side by mountains and steep cliffs into the ocean on the other side. And so Leonidas holds. Only when the Persians find that there is a pass around the Spartans and the other Greeks that follow Leonidas into battle, do they defeat the defenses of Thermopylae. But by that time, Leonidas had sent back most of the other Greek soldiers who had followed the Spartans to Thermopylae, and only the Spartan 300 fought the last climactic battle there. This battle was an Pyrrhic victory for the Persians. While they kill the Spartans to a man, it buys the Greeks time not only to come up with a defense on land, but to organize a defense at sea as well. Because the Persians will march south, they will take Athens, and they will burn the city to the ground. But by that time, the Athenians had evacuated. Now the Persians were in the situation of having long supply lines, and literally they can't live off the land because they burnt down the city, and the Athenians and the Greeks around the Persians have destroyed anything of value. They are highly reliant on the Persian navy for supplies. And here at Salamis, Salamis is this little island here that guards the harbor of Athens. Athens is right about in here. Here at the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian navy will destroy the Persian navy. So now the Persian military does not have the benefit of its own navy for supply, and it has these long supply lines over hostile ground. And just a year later at Plataea, the combined Greek army, so the Athenians, the Corinthians, the Spartans, the Thebians, the combined Greek army defeats Xerxes' forces and forces them to retreat all the way back to Persia. They not only force the Persians back, but they actually liberate this area right here. When they get to the Dardanelles Straits, they burn that bridge, that pontoon bridge made up of ships. They take that huge natural rope, and the Athenians cut out a section and hang a section of this rope in their city as a symbol of triumph. Now, how did the Greeks win? Well, they won using hoplite warfare. You see hoplite warfare stylized in the movie 300, where the Spartan soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder, their shields in one hand guarding the right side of the fellow next to them. And they open the shield either to stab with their spears or to slash with their short swords. Only when the enemy starts to break do the Spartans and other Greeks, when they're fighting using this, break this phalanx, this tight packed formation, and then they run out and fight as individuals. In a lot of ways, the phalanx is beneficial because it allows the Spartans or the Greeks to absorb the mass attacks of a much larger enemy. Again, using 300 as an example. You see the Persian soldiers, lightly clad with they don't have the heavy armor, the heavy bronze armor that the Greeks fought with, rushing forward and literally slamming into the Greek lines, into the Spartan lines. And of course the phalanx, since you have somebody behind you with their shield in the small of your back, keeping you in place. And that reassurance of somebody physically keeping you upright allows you to hold the line, opening the shield only up to stab or slash when it's convenient. And of course, when the enemy finally starts to break, when he's exhausted his attack, that's when the phalanx will start to march forward methodically, marching, killing, and slashing. And then when finally the enemy starts to break, the soldiers break out of the phalanx and fight as individual soldiers. Now, next class period, we're going to talk about Greece at its height. We're going to talk about Greek culture, because it's during this time period after the Persian War that you have the advancement of Greek philosophy, the ideas, the expansion of Greek democracy. And all of this is because of the heyday of Greece due to the victory over the Persians. And we'll talk about that next lecture. So I'm going to let you go for tonight. It's actually, right now while I'm recording this, quite dark, and I still have to prepare this to be uploaded onto iTunes. But next lecture, we'll talk about Greece at its height and how Greece at its height, the benefits of Greece at its height will sow the seeds for its final decline. Have a good night.